It's time now for Mark Meets, in which I speak to the biggest names in the world of politics, sport, showbiz and beyond. Tonight, the Right Honourable, the Lord Lilley. Peter Lilley, one of the most experienced politicians in the country, who sat in the House of Commons as a Member of Parliament for over 3 decades, from 1983 to 2017. And in that time, he served as a cabinet minister in the governments of both Margaret, Thatcher and John Major as Trade and Industry Secretary and Social Security Secretary, respectively. He has been a long-time critic of the European Union and backed Brexit in 2016. And in May 2018, he was nominated for a peerage in the House of Lords, where he sits to this day. Lord Lilley, Peter Lilley, welcome to Mark Dolan tonight.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Lovely to have you on the programme. A great privilege as well. As I mentioned before we went on air, I watched you with keen interest as a politics student in the 90s. I was at Edinburgh Uni, by the way, where we still got a proper meat-based meal.
In those days, but I suspect if you'd said anything too nice about me in your essays, you'd have been marked down. And
most certainly. I wouldn't have got that coveted tutu. So, Peter, let's get started. Why did you enter politics in the first place?
I was always fascinated by politics as a child. For no obvious reason, my parents weren't at all political. And didn't think it would be possible ever to get into Parliament, but it was sort of something I dreamt of, but I assumed you had to be born into the right sort of milieu and family and have connections. Then at university, I saw people ahead of me, the slightly older Cambridge generation, people like Ken Clarke.
Well, you're part of the Cambridge mafia.
I'm the tail end of it.
Michael Howard, Ken
Michael
Clarke.
Howard, Norman Lamont, Ken Clarke and so on. And I thought they were terrifically self-confident. I couldn't quite do as well as them, so I didn't do anything. But I thought it must be possible to do better in the long run. And eventually I saw they were making progress, and I thought, well, actually in this country, it is a free country. If you really want to be in Parliament and you're not entirely stupid, and even some people who are entirely stupid, you can get in if you're determined enough. So it took me a long time. I didn't get in until I was nearly 40.
But did you contest Tottenham in 74?
I did. I fought Tottenham, and Tottenham fought back.
Right, yes. But that would have been a good political education, I would have thought.
Oh, it was, enormously.
Yeah. A Labour stronghold.
Absolutely.
Indeed. And I wonder, what shaped your political outlook? Was it your parents? Was it your upbringing? Or was it just life in the 70s?
I think it was, my views were sort of naturally conservative, even when I was a child, even though I can remember asking my father, what were we, when I heard there was a difference between Labour and Conservative. And he said, well, nothing really, that he'd been a radical before the war, but fought in the Navy and just sort of made him reconciled to king and country. But they didn't have any strong political views. Indeed, my mother thought politics was the most disreputable thing you could possibly do. And when I finally became an MP, she was simultaneously very proud, but said to her friends, isn't it a shame he can't be an MP without being a politician?
Yes, indeed. I mean, that's a rare breed, isn't it? And if you're going to do that, you probably won't get very far, will you? You certainly won't get into the cabinet.
No.
So, and what about the 70s and, how life was? I mean, how bad was it for Britain in the 70s, pre-Thatcher, 75, and then leading up to the winter of discontent in 78 into 79? Well,
it was very grim indeed. We had the 3-day week when, we have problems now, but when there wasn't enough electricity to keep industry going for more than 3 days a week, that was pretty disastrous. My now wife, then I didn't know her, but she had to run a clothing business in those days when you could only get staff in the days you had the electricity to run the sewing machines and so on, and you had to keep them there as long as possible. So that was a disaster. Then you had strikes in a whole range of things. We were the slowest growing country in Europe, major country in Europe, for that combination of state control of industry. We had more nationalised industries than most. We had a higher rate of inflation than most. We had a higher level of unemployment than most, and we had strikes and disorder.
Inflation topped out in the over 20%.
25%.
And then, of course, the pay rises were going in a similar direction, weren't they? Harold Wilson agreeing to 15, 20, 25% pay rises.
Well, he had to, even though we'd moved to total control by the state of every price, wage, salary, dividend in the economy. And actually, that's when I got to know Geoffrey Howe, who's the Minister for Prices and Consumer Affairs. And he said he realised the whole thing was mad when he was asked as a minister to decide on the price of a charity ticket to a fete outside Cambridge. And you can't run an economy like that. We had to scrap all that, return to a free economy and control inflation by controlling the money supply and monetary demand.
And
something we ought to have remembered during the COVID issue.
Indeed. Well, let's develop that. What is your appraisal of the COVID response, the lockdowns and the other measures that we saw?
Well, they were a huge mistake, but it was compounded. But it was sort of understandable that you might be so terrified of what this disease was going to do, that you would have to lock down. But once you decided to lock down and stop people working, the Bank of England said, that's created a recession. What do you do in recessions? You print lots of money to get out of it. But this was the first recession ever that was caused by suppressing supply, not by inadequate demand. So when they opened up again, there was too much money in the economy, and that's created the subsequent inflation. It's made a bit worse by the Ukraine war, but it would have happened anyway.
Yes, and would you sort of say that actually the response from the government was quite unconservative? Because if you look to the Swedish approach, it was to give citizens the information about the virus, let them know that here's the risk and you can wear a mask or you don't have to wear a mask, go to work, don't go to work. But it was individual choice, self-determination, responsibility for your own welfare. Ought we have taken that route?
We should have done, certainly with the benefit of hindsight. And even at the time, there were plenty of people saying that. And actually, to his credit, Boris's initial desire was not to lock down, but to do it. And the sort of basic game plan was that you couldn't control diseases by locking down. And they eventually were more or less bounced into it by absurd projections that we'd all be dead 3 times over. And they took the decision to lock down, and that became the new norm, the doctrine. Any new variant came along, we must lock down again. And again, Boris did take the decision to end lockdown earlier than most other countries, which was one of the things he can be proud of.
You served under Margaret Thatcher. Would she have folded to Sage in the same way that Boris Johnson did?
She wouldn't, for 2 reasons. One, her personality, and the other, she was a scientist by training. And she'd have challenged these so-called scientists who were simply, drawing a line through a few points and extrapolating it into the middle distance. And she'd have challenged it. That was her great strength. She loved to argue, and she tested any proposal for a policy by arguing to destruction. People thought she was being arrogant. She wasn't. She was seeing whether you got any comeback. If you could respond to her arguments and convince her that you were right and she was wrong, she'd take your policies on board. And she'd have given a really tough time to those scientists who were trying to urge lockdowns as much for political reasons, for any scientific reason.
I think a devastating appraisal there. I find it hard to disagree with Lord Peter Lilley, who returns in just a couple of minutes. More about what it was like serving under Margaret Thatcher, also the major years as well. What does Lord Lilley make of Rishi Sunak? Can we sort out the Northern Ireland Protocol? Does he have Brexit buyer's regret? And will we ever crack the issue of illegal immigration? All of that to come. Lord Peter Lilley live in the studio. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Mark Dolan tonight. The papers in just a few minutes, but still with me, one of the most experienced politicians in the country, a man who served in the cabinet under Margaret Thatcher and John Major, Lord Peter Lilley. So, Peter, let's talk about Margaret Thatcher. You caught the tail end of her prime ministerial career as Trade and Industry Secretary. So you served under her for a few months, but you knew her well in advance of that.
Yes, I'd somehow come to her attention before I ever got into Parliament. And she's
late 70s, early 80s.
And she came and had lunch with my senior partner in my firm where I was a partner. Oh, well, I wasn't at that stage partner. And said, could you second Peter to research department so that he can write speeches and policy papers? And my boss said, well, no, actually, we need him. And she, in her forceful way, said, well, couldn't you do a deal? Half his time for me and half for you. 3.5 days a week for you, 3.5 days a week for me. She assumed everybody worked 7-day week. In the end, a sort of compromise was worked out where I worked for her in the evenings and weekends, and I continued to work my firm during the day.
And what do you know about Margaret Thatcher that we don't?
Well, I was saying beforehand how she tests an idea by arguing against it. And if you went to her, when I got into Parliament, I was used to it, but when I got into Parliament, her closest supporters, the No Turning Back group, invited her to dinner to discuss a policy paper we produced. She came to dinner and she tore it to shreds, and we came back with counter-arguments. She tore them to shreds, we came back with counter-arguments. And then she left and everybody was stunned, and they said, it's true what she says, what they say about her, she's arrogant, she doesn't listen, and so on. And I said, but we won the argument. They said, that makes it worse. I said, no, we won the argument. She knows we won the argument. She's now going back to give hell to the officials who gave a bad briefing, and she duly took on board our policy ideas. But she often left the impression she wasn't listening, but she was. She was testing to see, Mark, was that a good argument? No. And if your arguments were persuasive, she took them on board. And that's a very good way of governing, actually. She possibly could have done it in a slightly more ameliorative tone so that people didn't feel hurt, but never take aboard a policy until you really looked at every conceivable weakness. And then when you've sorted it, that it's strong, and you know the problems that you're going to face, then put 100% of your weight behind it. And she did that with incredible energy and commitment. And that's why she was so successful.
And she was a tough boss, but you served under her, and then you were served under John Major as the Social Security Secretary for 5 years. So a substantial cabinet career. And now the country faces parallel challenges that Thatcher faced in 79. Luckily, mercifully low unemployment, but high inflation, a cost of living crisis, and also massive debt. So Rishi Sunak, is he the man to tackle these problems? What's your judgment of Sunak? Is he a good Prime Minister?
I think he is. I think just in the privacy of this room. If I were asked to offer him advice, I'd say the one thing you need to learn from Mrs. Thatcher is to have fire in your belly. He is very like her. He's cautious. He looks at problems in great detail before he commits himself. But once he's committed himself, he needs to show more enthusiasm for what he's doing and sound less like, the family accountant. Your family has an accountant.
Yeah, it does. It does.
So I think I think he'll learn that. He's only been there a few weeks.
Do you think he's got the character, the backbone that Thatcher did? Because that's the ultimate quality that's needed, especially at this moment, isn't it? Because he's going to have to battle the unions and he's going to have to face down many interest groups in order to pursue his vision for the economy.
Well, that's judging by an incredibly high standard. Mrs. Thatcher was the greatest peacetime Prime Minister we've ever had, I suspect, at least since Lord Salisbury at the turn of the century before last. But he's undoubtedly the best person we've got in the political spectrum, I think, to run the country at the moment. And it's a shame that we had that sort of interlude where he wasn't elected and then he was. And we'd have been a bit ahead of the game if that hadn't occurred. But no, he's a very good, very intelligent, very nice man. And once he's got fire in the belly, I think he'll start climbing up the opinion polls. You've been a Eurosceptic for decades. How do you feel Brexit is going, and can that Northern Ireland Protocol be resolved? Well, the ultimate purpose of Brexit was to take back control of our laws so that we can mould them to our own needs. We'll either do that well or badly. The trouble is, not that we've done it well or badly, but we haven't done enough of it. We've only just started. We've begun to. We've got the Financial Services and Markets Bill this week, which is reforming the rules of our biggest industry to shed some of the cumbersome weight that the European regulations put on it and make us back competitive with New York, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Before that, we had the Precision Breeding Bill. Sounds very technical, but it's supported by not only by the agricultural industry, but all the other parties, which will enable our industry to use the processes developed in our laboratories to breed plants, precision design for what we need. And that was banned in Europe. We'll give a head start there. So things are beginning to happen, slow, too late, but they're moving in the right direction. Even things like, you remember about a year and a half ago, we had that great shortage of lorry drivers. Where's it all gone? Partly because we changed half a dozen rules that we couldn't have changed if we'd been in the EU. Plus, people put up pay of lorry drivers. And that basic crisis has disappeared. So you don't have any buyer's remorse whatsoever. What about that protocol? I mean, that's another test of Rishi Sunak's political backbone, isn't it? It is. And I'm worried when I hear talk about some sort of half-baked compromise that doesn't replace it. It was a temporary agreement. the EU said they couldn't enter into a permanent agreement on trade under Article 50 when we left. That had to be done after we left. But they put that thing in the Article 50 departure terms to deal with the possibility there wouldn't be any trade agreement between us and the EU and to ensure that there weren't any problems at the border. Right, we don't want any infrastructural controls at the border, and we've got to help the EU protect its own market from any goods which we don't regulate in the same way as they do. We can do that quite easily by simply passing a law saying it is illegal to export from Northern Ireland any goods which don't conform to EU standards and regulations. And we wouldn't have to enforce it at the border, enforce it like all export controls, and we have export controls on quite a lot of things, at the point of dispatch in the factory that makes it or in the warehouse that sends it.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
Where there's a will, there's a way, and there's an opportunity. And that basic idea was put forward by former Director General of the EU, so he knows about EU law, and a couple of professors of European law, one American, one Italian, and dismissed out of hand by the EU, even though it had such impeccable EU credentials. And we've just got to stand up to them and say, sorry, you said the original agreement's temporary, we're calling a close on that, and we want to do something which is we will protect your interests, we'll protect the interests of Ireland and peace there, but we're not going to divide our own country in two. Imagine if America was suddenly told that any goods going from the west coast of America up to Alaska had to go through Canadian controls.
For the birds. Good luck with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Or from France to Corsica had to go through some.
Yes.
You know, it just wouldn't happen.
And it's a great injustice for the people of Northern Ireland. We've got the papers coming. The clock's against us, Lord Peter Lilley. We could talk to you all night. Briefly, if you can, I won't hold you to this, but it's crystal ball time. The date and the outcome of the next election. Today.
Well,
I mean, I don't mean if it was today, but we anticipate 2 years max.
Well,
and it won't be January.
The latest it can be is January
2025.
But there's a basic rule in British politics that the government of the day calls an election in the first Thursday in the last year when it's ahead in the opinion polls. And it's probably going to be quite late before we're high enough in the opinion polls to risk calling an election. So it will be at the end, whether or not we'll win, I don't know. It's really, if we had one tomorrow, we'd lose.
Brilliant. Lord Peter Lilley, do come and see us again soon. Most fascinating conversation. Thank you for giving up a chunk of your Sunday night to tell us about your remarkable career. Lord Peter Lilley.